The church bells had barely finished their wedding song when a ghost walked through the door, dirty, scarred, and very much alive. The autumn of 1863 had painted Millbrook's maple trees in shades of rust and gold, but inside the whitewashed chapel, all eyes were fixed on the vision in ivory silk. Mabel and Cordelia stood at the altar, her honey-colored hair crowned with her grandmother's pearls, her hands trembling as they held a bouquet of late roses. The scent of lavender and beeswax candles filled the air, mixing with the nervous breath of 200 wedding guests. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Murphy began, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Miss Mabel and Cordelia and Mr. Nathaniel Barlow." Nathaniel stood tall beside her, his Sunday best pressed to perfection, his dark hair slicked back with pomade. He was handsome in the way that mothers approved of, steady, respectable, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The same smile he'd worn since childhood, when he'd follow Franklin roads like a shadow, always the second son, always the one who stayed behind. You could smell the September harvest on the breeze that drifted through the open windows, apples and wood smoke, and the faint promise of winter. The congregation settled into the familiar rhythm of the service, ladies fanning themselves with their prayer books, men shifting in their starched collars. Mrs. Florence Ida Whitmore dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, already weeping for joy, while her husband Hiram Greeley adjusted his spectacles and studied the young couple with the calculating gaze of a man who understood the economics of love. But it was Winifred Bly who saw him first. She sat in the back pew, her journalist's eyes always scanning, always searching for the story beneath the story. Her dark hair was pinned severely back, her dress plain brown wool that marked her as working class among the silk and taffeta. She'd come to write about the wedding for the Millbrook Gazette, a simple social notice that would run beside advertisements for patent medicines and livestock auctions. The door creaked open just as Reverend Murphy asked if anyone objected to the union. Standard words, ceremonial words, words that no one ever expected to be answered. Except today, a figure stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, tall and lean, wearing a Union Army coat that had seen too many battles. His hair was longer than fashion dictated, sun-bleached and unkempt. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pulling his smile into something that might have been beautiful once. His eyes, those unmistakable green eyes, swept the congregation until they found their target. The collective intake of breath was audible. Florence Ida's handkerchief fluttered to the floor. Hiram's spectacles slipped down his nose. Even Reverend Murphy's Bible trembled in his hands. Franklin, Mabel Ann's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried in the sudden silence like a prayer. Franklin. Rhodes stepped into the chapel, his boots echoing against the worn wooden floor. Each step was deliberate, measured, like a man walking toward his own execution. The congregation parted before him, their faces a mixture of shock and something that might have been fear. After all, they'd buried him 2 years ago. They'd sung hymns over his empty grave, had wept for the boy who'd gone to war and never come home. "Hello, Mabel," he said, and his voice was different now. Rougher, deeper, scarred by smoke and screaming and things that no man should have to see. "I'm sorry I'm late." Nathaniel's face had gone white as his shirt collar. His hands, which had been steady enough to shoe horses and mend fences, now shook as he reached for Mabel's arm. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "You're dead. We had the telegram. We had the funeral." Franklin's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Reports of my death, it seems, were greatly exaggerated." He paused, his gaze moving from Nathaniel to Mabel, and for a moment, the years fell away. She was 17 again, laughing as she danced at the harvest festival, her skirts whirling around her ankles. He was 19, drunk on moonshine and possibility, promising her he'd come back a hero. "I kept my word," he said quietly. "I came back." The roses in Mabel's bouquet trembled, their petals beginning to fall like tears. One by one, they drifted to the floor, leaving spots of red against the white wood. She stared at him as if seeing a vision, her brown eyes wide with something that might have been hope or might have been horror. "Franklin," she breathed, and the name held 2 years of grief, 2 years of learning to live without him. "They said you were killed at Gettysburg." They said a lot of things. His voice carried the weight of unmarked graves and burning fields. Most of them were lies. Winifred Bly's pencil scratched across her notepad, capturing every word, every gesture. This was no longer a wedding announcement. This was the story of the decade, maybe the century. A ghost returning to claim his bride, a love triangle that would be whispered about in parlors and general stores for generations. Nathaniel stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. "You're too late, Franklin. She's mine now. We were going to be married, and by God, we will be." The two men faced each other across the altar, best friends turned rivals, separated by war and death, and the woman who stood between them. The congregation held its breath, waiting for the explosion that was sure to come, but Franklin didn't move. He simply stood there, studying the scene before him. The woman he'd loved, the friend he'd trusted, the life he'd expected to return to. His green eyes held secrets now, stories that would take a lifetime to tell. "Were you happy?" he asked Mabel, and his voice was so soft that only she could hear. "All this time, were you happy?" Before she could answer, the sound of hoofbeats thundered outside, accompanied by shouts and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. But the real question wasn't whether Franklin Rhodes had returned from the dead. It was why someone was so determined to send him back. The chapel erupted into chaos as the first bullet shattered the stained glass window above the altar. Colored fragments of St. Matthew rained down like deadly confetti, and the congregation scattered like startled birds. Women screamed, men shouted, and through it all, Franklin Rhodes stood perfectly still, his hand moving instinctively to where his sidearm should have been. "Get down," he roared, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd commanded troops through hell itself. But his eyes never left Mabel's face, even as Nathaniel grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the vestry. "This way," Nathaniel urged, his voice tight with fear. "We can get out through the back." But Mabel twisted in his grip, her wedding dress catching on the communion rail. "Wait," she gasped. "Franklin, is exactly why this is happening," Nathaniel snapped, and there was something in his tone that made Winifred Bly look up from where she'd taken shelter behind a pew. The journalist's sharp eyes caught the way Nathaniel's jaw tightened, the way his gaze flickered toward the shattered window with something that looked suspiciously like expectation rather than surprise. Franklin had already moved, his body remembering the dance of warfare. He rolled behind the altar as another shot splintered the wooden cross above his head. "How many?" he called out to Hiram Greeley, who was peering through a crack in the shutters. "For riders," Hiram replied, his voice steadier than a man his age had any right to be. "Armed and circling the building." Florence Ida clutched her husband's arm. Who would do such a thing? At a wedding, of all places. Men who don't care about sacred ground, Franklin muttered, checking the small derringer he'd kept hidden in his boot. 2 shots. Against 4 armed men. It wouldn't be nearly enough. Winifred Bly crawled across the floor, her brown dress blending with the shadows. "This isn't random," she whispered urgently to Franklin. "Someone knew you'd be here. Someone was waiting." Franklin's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "You're sharper than most, Miss Bly." Winifred Bly, Millbrook Gazette. She studied his face, taking in the way his eyes constantly moved, cataloging exits and threats. "You're not surprised by this." "I'm surprised I made it this far," he admitted. "I've been running for 3 months. Figured I'd have one last chance to see her before." Another volley of shots peppered the chapel walls. Through the chaos, Mabel's voice rose clear and strong. "Stop this. All of you, stop." She stood in the center of the aisle, her white dress stark against the dim interior, her grandmother's pearls catching what little light filtered through the remaining windows. Nathaniel reached for her, but she shook him off. "Franklin Rhodes," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd been running her father's farm since she was 16. "You come back from the dead and bring gunfire to my wedding. I think I deserve an explanation." The shooting stopped. Whether it was respect for her courage or simple curiosity, the attackers seemed willing to listen. Franklin rose slowly from behind the altar, his hands visible but ready. "Some explanations are worth dying for," he said quietly. "Others are worth killing for." Mabel's brown eyes flashed. "And which is yours?" Before Franklin could answer, a new voice cut through the tension, smooth, cultured, with the slight drawl of Virginia aristocracy. Perhaps I can illuminate the situation. A man stepped through the broken chapel door, impeccably dressed despite the violence. His gray suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair pomaded to perfection. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, flanked by two armed men who kept their weapons trained on Franklin. Colonel Reginald Ashford, Franklin said, his voice flat as a tombstone. I wondered when you'd crawl out from under your rock. Major Rhodes, Ashford replied with mock courtesy. Though I suppose your military rank is somewhat in question now, isn't it? Winifred Bly's pencil flew across her notepad. She'd heard whispers of Colonel Ashford, a Confederate officer who'd supposedly died in Richmond's fall. Yet here he stood, very much alive, very much in control. What's this about? Nathaniel demanded, still gripping Mabel's arm. What does any of this have to do with us? Ashford's smile was cold as winter frost. Why don't you ask your bride, Mr. Barlow? Or perhaps you should ask your best friend here what he discovered in that burned-out plantation house outside Savannah. The color drained from Mabel's face. Franklin's hand tightened on his derringer, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. I found ledgers, Franklin said quietly. Records of gold shipments. Union gold, supposed to be funding Reconstruction efforts. Gold that never made it to its destination. Gold that certain prominent citizens of this very town helped disappear, Ashford added, his gaze moving meaningfully toward Hiram Greeley. Men who thought their little arrangement would stay buried with the war. Hiram's face had gone ashen. Florence Ida stared at her husband in horror. Hiram? What is he talking about? It was business, Hiram whispered. Just business. The war was ending, and men had to think of the future. Men like you, Franklin said, his voice carrying the weight of betrayal. Men who sold information to the highest bidder. Men who got good soldiers killed for profit. And men who thought they could disappear an inconvenient witness, Ashford continued. But Major Rhodes proved remarkably difficult to kill. 3 attempts, wasn't it? The explosion at the munitions depot, the accident with the cavalry charge, and of course, the report of his death at Gettysburg. Mabel's hand flew to her throat. You mean? I mean your beloved Franklin has been living under a death sentence for 2 years, Ashford said smoothly. And certain people in this town have been sleeping very poorly, wondering when he might return to share what he knows. Nathaniel's grip on Mabel's arm tightened. This is madness. Hiram's been like a father to me. He wouldn't what? Winifred Bly interrupted, her journalist's instincts fully engaged. Wouldn't betray his country for gold? Wouldn't arrange for an inconvenient witness to disappear? Wouldn't ensure his protege married the woman his enemy loved? The pieces were falling into place like dominoes in a storm. Nathaniel's sudden courtship of Mabel after Franklin's supposed death. Hiram's patronage of the young man. The convenient timing of today's attack. You son of a bitch, Franklin breathed, his green eyes fixed on Nathaniel. You knew I was alive, and you knew they'd come for me. Nathaniel's face crumpled. I didn't have a choice. They said they'd kill her if I didn't cooperate. They said if I could just keep her safe, keep her away from you. Keep her away from the truth, you mean, Mabel said, her voice deadly quiet. But the truth, as Franklin had learned in 2 years of running, was a luxury that men like Colonel Ashford couldn't afford to let live. The silence that followed Mabel's words was broken only by the distant sound of horses pawing the earth outside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light, and somewhere in the chapel's rafters, a mourning dove called out its lonely song. The truth, Colonel Ashford repeated, savoring the word like fine whiskey. Such a dangerous thing, truth. It has a way of destroying carefully constructed lives. Franklin kept his eyes on Nathaniel, watching his former best friend's face crumble like ancient parchment. How long have you known I was alive? 6 months, Nathaniel whispered, his voice barely audible. Hiram received word from his contacts in Richmond. They said you'd been seen asking questions, following paper trails. And you said nothing. Mabel's voice carried a hurt so profound it seemed to echo off the chapel walls. You courted me, proposed to me, stood here ready to marry me, all while knowing. I thought I was protecting you. Nathaniel's composure finally shattered. Do you have any idea what these men are capable of? What they did to anyone who got in their way? Winifred Bly's pencil never stopped moving. This was the story that would make her career, if she lived to write it. How much gold are we talking about, Colonel? Ashford's smile was predatory. Enough to buy a small army. Enough to fund certain political activities that the new government would find most disagreeable. You mean enough to restart the war? Franklin said flatly. That's what this is about, isn't it? The gold wasn't just theft, it was treason. The war never ended, Major Rhodes. Ashford's voice carried the fervor of true belief. It merely relocated, became more subtle, more sophisticated. Florence Ida found her voice at last. Hiram, tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't steal from the government. Tell me you didn't. I did what I had to do. Hiram interrupted, his shoulders straightening with defiance. This town was dying, Florence. The war took our sons, our resources, our hope. When Colonel Ashford approached me with a proposal that would ensure our survival, you sold your soul, Franklin finished. And when I started asking questions about discrepancies in the supply records, you decided to sell mine too. The chapel door creaked open again, and another figure entered, a woman this time, her traveling dress dusty from hard riding. She was perhaps 30, with steel-gray eyes and prematurely silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her movements were precise, economical, like a dancer or a killer. Mrs. Victoria Helm, Ashford said by way of introduction. My associate in matters requiring discretion. Victoria's gaze swept the chapel, taking in the scattered congregation, the broken glass, the standoff at the altar. This is messier than we planned, Colonel. Sometimes circumstances require adaptation, Ashford replied. Major Rhodes has proven remarkably resourceful. I prefer to think of it as stubborn, Franklin said. 2 years of running tends to motivate a man to find answers. And what answers did you find? Mabel asked, stepping closer to him despite Nathaniel's restraining hand. What was worth risking everything for? Franklin's scarred face softened as he looked at her. I found that the gold wasn't just funding Confederate sympathizers. It was buying Union officials, judges, congressmen, creating a network of corruption that reached all the way to Washington. Winifred Bly's eyes widened. A shadow government. More than that, Franklin continued. A way to control Reconstruction, to ensure that certain interests, certain people, would profit from the nation's rebuilding. The war might have ended, but the real battle was just beginning. And you thought you could stop it? Victorious voice held a note of amused contempt. One man against an organization with tentacles in every major city. I thought I could expose it, Franklin replied. I thought people had a right to know that their government was being bought and sold like livestock at market. Noble, Ashford said. Naive, but noble. Unfortunately, nobility is a luxury we can't afford. He gestured to his men, and they raised their weapons. The congregation cowered, but Mabel stood her ground. Wait, she said, her voice ringing with authority. If you're going to kill us all, at least have the courtesy to explain why my wedding had to be the place for it. Because, my dear, Victoria said, her smile cold as January wind, your wedding was the perfect cover. A tragic attack by Confederate holdouts, perhaps, or Union deserters. The details matter less than the result. Everyone who knows the truth dies here, today. Including Nathaniel? Mabel asked. Including everyone, Ashford confirmed. Even our collaborators have become liabilities. Nathaniel's face went white. But you promised. I promised you many things, Ashford said dismissively. Most of them were lies. Surely you didn't think we'd allow you to live with such dangerous knowledge. The betrayal hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. He staggered backward, releasing Mabel's arm. I did everything you asked. I courted her. I kept her away from Franklin. You were useful, Victoria interrupted. Past tense. Franklin caught Mabel's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the vestry door. She understood immediately. They'd shared enough silent conversations in their youth to read each other's thoughts. There's just one problem with your plan, Franklin said, his voice carrying a confidence he didn't entirely feel. You assumed I came here alone. Ashford's smile faltered. What do you mean? I mean that story Miss Bly has been writing? It's not just notes for the Gazette. It's a detailed account of everything we've discussed here today, and copies of those ledgers I found. They're already in the hands of federal marshals in 3 different cities. Winifred Bly caught on quickly, including the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy, she added, her voice steady despite the weapons trained on her. Every politician, every banker, enough. Victoria snapped, raising her own pistol. You're bluffing. Am I? Franklin's smile was sharp as a blade. Tell me, Colonel, why do you think it took me so long to come back? I wasn't just hiding. I was preparing, building a case, gathering evidence, making sure that if something happened to me, the truth would still come out. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and through the broken windows came the distinctive call of a cavalry horn. Not the Confederate bugle that had haunted Franklin's nightmares, but the clear, clean notes of Union cavalry. Ah, Franklin said, his grin widening. Right on time. But as the Federal marshals surrounded the chapel, Franklin couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The chapel doors burst open with such force that the hinges screamed in protest. Federal marshals poured through the entrance, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the wedding finery scattered throughout the pews. Marshal William Garrett led the charge, his grizzled face set in grim determination, his service revolver drawn but not yet aimed. Nobody moved. Garrett's voice boomed through the chapel like thunder. This is a federal operation. Colonel Ashford's composure cracked for the first time. His pale eyes darted between the marshals and Franklin, calculating odds that were rapidly shifting against him. This is a private matter, Marshal. A simple dispute over stolen Union gold and treason. Garrett interrupted, his weathered face hard as granite. We know all about your little network, Colonel. Major Rhodes here has been most illuminating in his correspondence. Victoria. Helm's hand moved toward her concealed weapon, but 3 marshal deputies had their guns trained on her before she could draw. The woman's steel-gray eyes betrayed nothing, but Franklin caught the slight tension in her shoulders, the coiled readiness of a predator preparing to strike. You see, Colonel, Franklin said, stepping protectively in front of Mabel. Those 2 years I spent running weren't just about survival. They were about building a case. Every contact, every transaction, every dirty deal, documented and delivered to the proper authorities. Winifred Bly's pencil flew across her notepad, capturing every word. This was beyond journalism now. This was history being written in real time. How extensive is this conspiracy, Marshal? Extensive enough to hang half the Confederate leadership that supposedly died in Richmond, Garrett replied grimly. And corrupt enough to implicate Union officials from here to Washington. Hiram Greeley sank into the nearest pew, his face ashen. Florence Ida stared at her husband with the hollow eyes of a woman watching her world crumble. All these years, she whispered, all these years you've been providing for our future, Hiram finished desperately. Everything I did for this town, for our family, for your own greed, Mabel said, her voice cutting through his justifications like a blade. You let us mourn Franklin. You let me believe he was dead while you plotted to kill him. I never wanted anyone to die. Hiram protested. I just wanted the gold to disappear quietly, to let sleeping dogs lie. But sleeping dogs have a way of waking up, Franklin observed. Especially when they smell blood. Marshal Garrett gestured to his men. Arrest Colonel Ashford and his associates. Charge them with treason, conspiracy, and attempted murder. You're making a mistake, Marshal, Ashford said, his voice regaining its aristocratic composure. My organization has reach you can't imagine. Influence in places that had influence, Garrett corrected. Past tense. Amazing how quickly rats abandon a sinking ship when they realize the captain's been talking to federal authorities. Victoria Helm finally spoke, her voice calm despite the weapons surrounding her. You think this ends here? You think arresting a few people will stop what we've built? I think, Franklin said quietly, that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Once people know what you've been doing, how you've been manipulating them, your power disappears. Power doesn't disappear, Victoria replied. It just changes hands. Something in her tone made Franklin's blood run cold. He'd heard that certainty before, in the voices of men who'd already accepted their own deaths because they believed their cause would outlive them. Marshal, he said urgently, we need to. The explosion came from outside, sudden and violent. The chapel windows that had survived the gunfire now shattered completely, showering the interior with glass. Through the smoke and dust, Franklin could see flames licking at the building's wooden siding. Damn, Garrett cursed. They had a backup plan. More than that, Victoria said, her smile returning. They had orders to burn everything if we were compromised. The chapel, the town records, the The schoolhouse, Mabel gasped. The children are still in the schoolhouse for evening studies. Franklin's heart stopped. The schoolhouse sat directly across from the chapel, its windows facing the street. If Ashford's men were willing to burn everything down to cover their tracks. How many children? Garrett demanded. 15, maybe 20, Mabel replied, already moving toward the door. Miss Catherine was holding extra lessons for the Harvest Festival recital. You're not going out there, Nathaniel said, grabbing her arm. Despite everything, the betrayal, the lies, the revelation of his cowardice, his concern for her safety was genuine. Those children, Mabel began, are exactly why you need to stay here, Franklin interrupted. The building's on fire there. Are armed men outside, and they're desperate enough to kill anyone who gets in their way, including children. Winifred Bly asked, her journalist's instincts warring with her humanity. Especially children, Victoria said matter-of-factly. Dead. Children make powerful symbols. Tragic casualties of a Confederate raid, perhaps, or Union brutality, depending on which story serves our purposes better. Marshal Garrett's jaw tightened. You sick. Another explosion rocked the chapel, this one closer. Through the smoke, Franklin could see riders circling the building, there. Torches bright against the gathering dusk. They weren't trying to escape. They were trying to destroy the evidence, along with anyone who might testify. We need to get those children out, Franklin said, checking his derringer. 2 shots against unknown numbers. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse. It's suicide, Garrett said. We're outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a burning building. Then, we make it count, Franklin replied. He turned to Mabel, his scarred face soft with an emotion that had survived 2 years of war and betrayal. If I don't, you will, she said firmly. You came back from the dead once, Franklin Rhodes. You can do it again. And if I can't? Mabel's brown eyes held his, steady and sure. Then you die knowing you tried to save those children. That's all any of us can do. Through the smoke and chaos, Nathaniel stepped forward. I'm coming with you. Franklin stared at his former best friend. After everything, those children don't deserve to die for my mistakes, Nathaniel said quietly. Maybe this is my chance to do something right. But as Franklin prepared to run toward the flames, he couldn't shake the feeling that Colonel Ashford's real plan was just beginning to unfold. The schoolhouse was already half consumed by flames. When Franklin and Nathaniel burst through the smoke-filled street. Behind them, Marshal Garrett's men had formed a defensive line around the chapel, their rifles cracking in steady rhythm against Ashford's remaining forces. The acrid smell of burning wood mixed with gunpowder, creating a hellish atmosphere that reminded Franklin too much of Antietam. The back entrance, Nathaniel shouted over the roar of flames. Miss Catherine always keeps it unlocked during evening studies. They sprinted through the orange-tinted darkness, dodging bullets and burning debris. Franklin's scarred face was streaked with soot, but his green eyes burned with determination. He'd lost too much in this war. He wouldn't lose the future. 2. The schoolhouse's back door hung open, smoke pouring out like a gray waterfall. Inside, they could hear children's voices, not screaming, but singing. Even in the face of terror, Miss Catherine Morehouse was keeping her students calm with a hymn. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, drifted through the smoke, young voices pure and clear despite the chaos. Franklin and Nathaniel plunged into the burning building. The heat hit them like a physical blow, but they pressed forward, following the sound of singing. They found the children huddled in the back corner of the classroom. Miss Catherine's arms spread wide as if she could shield them all from the flames with her slight frame. Miss Catherine, Franklin called out. We're here to help. The young teacher's face, streaked with tears and soot, broke into a smile of relief. Mr. Rhodes, but you're alive and very much in a hurry, Franklin interrupted. How many children? 18, she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. The youngest is little Mary Hutchins, she's only 6. Franklin's heart clenched. 6 years old, the same age his sister had been when she died of fever. He pushed the memory away there. Would be time for ghosts later. We'll take them out in groups, he told Nathaniel. You take the older ones first. I'll bring up the rear with the little ones. No, Nathaniel said firmly. I'll take the rear. It's my fault they're in danger. Let me do something right for once. Franklin studied his former friend's face, seeing genuine resolve beneath the fear. All right, but we do this together or not at all. The evacuation was a nightmare of smoke and flame. Franklin carried little Mary Hutchins while guiding 3 other small children, their hands clutching his coat as they stumbled through the burning building. Behind him, Nathaniel shepherded the older students, his voice calm and encouraging despite the hell surrounding them. "That's it," Nathaniel called out. "Follow Mr. Rhodes. We're almost there." They emerged into the relatively clear air of the schoolyard just as another explosion rocked the building. The roof began to collapse, sending up a shower of sparks that lit the night sky like malevolent stars. "Is everyone out?" Franklin asked urgently, counting heads. "Everyone but," Miss Catherine began, then stopped, her face going white. "Samuel? Where's Samuel Morrison?" Franklin's blood turned to ice. Samuel Morrison, the minister's son, always sat in the front row, always eager to please. Where was he sitting? "Front left corner," Miss Catherine said, her voice breaking. "He was helping me organize the music for tomorrow's." Franklin was already moving, handing little Mary to Nathaniel. "Get them to safety. All of them." "Franklin, no." Nathaniel grabbed his arm. "The building's coming down. Then I better be fast." Franklin replied, shaking off his grip. "That boy's not dying on my watch." He plunged back into the inferno, the heat now so intense it seemed to sear his lungs with every breath. The roof groaned ominously above him, and he could hear the support beams beginning to crack. Through the smoke, he could see a small figure, huddled beneath a desk. Samuel Morrison, unconscious but breathing. Franklin scooped up the boy just as the ceiling began to cave in. He ran for the door, dodging falling timber and blazing debris. Behind him, the schoolhouse collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending up a pillar of flame that could be seen for miles. That he emerged carrying Samuel just as Marshal Garrett's men finished mopping up the last of Ashford's forces. The colonel himself sat in shackles, his aristocratic composure finally cracked, while Victoria Helms stared at the burning buildings with the satisfaction of a job well done. "You saved them," Mabel said, appearing at Franklin's side as he gently laid Samuel on the grass. The boy was stirring, his eyes fluttering open to focus on Franklin's scarred face. "Are we safe?" Samuel whispered. "We're safe," Franklin assured him. "All of us." As the flames died down and the smoke cleared, the people of Millbrook began to emerge from their hiding places. The chapel still stood, though scarred by fire and bullets. The schoolhouse was gone, but the children were alive. And in the flickering light of the dying flames, Franklin Rhodes finally looked like he was home. "What happens now?" Winifred Bly asked, her notepad finally still in her hands. "Now we rebuild," Franklin said simply. "We tell the truth, we face the consequences, and we try to do better." Mabel stepped closer to him, her wedding dress torn and stained with soot. "And us? What happens to us?" Franklin looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since walking into that chapel. She was no longer the 17-year-old girl he'd left behind. She was a woman now, tempered by loss and hardship, stronger than he'd ever imagined. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm not the same man who left for war. You're not the same woman who waited for me. Maybe we need to figure out who we are now before we can figure out what we mean to each other." "And Nathaniel?" she asked, glancing at the man who'd risked his life to save the children despite his earlier cowardice. "Nathaniel gets to live with his choices," Franklin replied. "Same as all of us." As dawn broke over Millbrook, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Franklin Rhodes stood among the ashes of the old world and looked toward the future. The war was finally over. Not just the one fought with guns and cannons, but the one fought with secrets and lies. He'd come home at last, not to reclaim what he'd lost, but to build something new. Remember to like this story if it moved you, and share your thoughts in the comments below. The greatest battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with truth, courage, and the willingness to forgive. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love hearing from our viewers around the world.